Hi, this is Prashant Bharadwaj again. Today we will introduce you to aggregate planning. What are some of the objectives in aggregate planning? What are some of the strategies? Aggregate planning is the topmost level in the hierarchy of operating decisions in operations management. And when we say aggregation, it can be done based on product families, like all the chairs and the tables and the desks aggregated into furniture items, or labor force, faculty teaching in different areas of business, faculty teaching in business, in arts, in sciences, combined together into faculty at IUP. And time here is weeks aggregated into months, months aggregated into quarters, quarters aggregated into a year. So what do we do in aggregate planning? In aggregate planning, the objective is to specify an optimal combination. The key word here is optimal, the best possible combination of these three: production or service rate, how many people to serve or how many units to produce; the labor force, the number of employees, also called capacity in my previous presentation; and then the third one is my inventory level. So if these are the three things that we plan for in the operating decisions of operations management: capacity, production or service, and inventory. So specifically at the aggregate planning level, we want to specify an optimal combination of these three. Now, what are the objectives in aggregate planning? As you see at the end of this slide, the objectives are conflicting with one another. So while I explain this, recognize that, and then I'll take you to a simple set of numbers to drive home that point also. The overarching objective is to minimize cost and maximize profit. That's exactly what every business wants to do, and in every function of the business, that is our objective. But let's go into specifics of what aggregate planning can do. Maximize customer satisfaction. Number one, customer satisfaction can be maximized by having good quality, good brand image. But here, aggregate planning does not talk about quality. It talks about capacity, production, and inventory. So how do you maximize customer satisfaction under the umbrella of aggregate planning? Specifically, minimize stockouts and back orders. Stockout is when the company cannot meet the demand of the customer, either because the customer is not willing to wait or the company has run out of this product and it is not making it again. Back order is when the company meets the demand late. So back orders may result in loss of customers, loss of customer goodwill. Stockouts, they are the worst case scenario. You don't want to have any stockouts. That is when the customer wanted the product but was not able to get that product. Now, how would you minimize stockouts and back orders? By having ample inventory. But look at what the second objective is saying: minimize inventory investment. It's because inventory is expensive. You don't want to have too much inventory either. But if you have less inventory, it can result in stockouts and back orders. Now let's say, okay, we don't want to have either. We will produce a steady number: 300, 300, 300, 300. Super. For example, if you produce 300 and your demand turns out to be 250, you have an inventory. If you produce 300 and your demand turns out to be 350, then you will have back orders and stockouts. So what do you want to do? You want to produce exactly equal to the demand. If the demand is 300, you produce 300. If the demand is 350, you produce 350. Well, that is good for these two objectives. But look at this. You want to minimize changes in production rates. You don't want to have different production rates. You don't want to have changes in workforce levels. You don't want to hire and lay off employees very often. You may say, I will have enough number of employees and I will use them as per the demand. But then you may have idle time. So you don't want to have any idle time. You want to maximize the utilization of all these resources. Let us look at this simple example here. We have the same aggregate planning objectives. I will demonstrate to you how they are conflicting in nature. In this example, you have one worker who can produce 10 units per time period. Initially, we have 25 employees. So the initial workforce can produce 250 units. Now look at the demand for 6 time periods. It is varying from 260 to 210 to 300 to 190 to 260 to 280. So the range is 210 to 300, the least to the highest. So my first objective is no stockouts. What is my highest demand? 300. So for me to assure no stockouts, I'm going to produce 300 every time period. Did I meet this objective now of no stockouts? Absolutely. Every period you produced more than the demand. Demand was 260, you produced 300. 210, 300, 300, 300, so on. But what happened? There was inventory. How much inventory did you incur in period 1? At the end of period 1, you produce 40 extra, so you have 40 in inventory. In the second time period, you produce 90 extra plus the 40 from the time period before, so you have 130. In third period, you produce nothing extra, but you still have that 130 in inventory. Fourth time period, you have produced 110 extra plus the 130 from the previous time period gave you the 240. 280, 300. You have 300 units in inventory at the end of 6 time periods. So the objective of no stockouts was met, but the next objective, no inventory, is certainly not met with this. So what would you do to meet the objective of no inventory for this demand? If your demand is 260, you produce 260. If your demand is 210, you produce 210, 300, 190, 260, 280. Are there going to be any inventory units at the end of any month? 0. Very good. But is it perfect? No. Why? Look at this. No changes in production rates. Next objective. What is happening here? Exactly the opposite of no changes. 260 in time period 1, 210, 300, 190. Every time there is a change in production rate. So how do you avoid that? Simple. Possibility. Take the average of all of these demands in 6 time periods. If you take the average, you will have an average of 250. So what do? I will produce a smooth quantity, even quantity of 250 every month. Now, am I meeting this objective? No changes in production rates? Absolutely. But how about my first 2 objectives? Maybe not. I don't think we would have met the objective of no stockouts and no inventory. Let's look. The demand in first month was 260, production was only 250. So negative 10. You have a back order. At the end of Second time period, you produced 250, you had a demand of 210. So you produce 40 extra. So if you meet the back order of 10 from the previous time period, you're still left with 30. Third time period, you produced 50 short, 250 instead of 300. So your inventory will be negative 20. You produced 50 short, but you had 30 from the previous time period. So you still are short by 20. The fourth time period, you produced 60 extra, but you had a back order of 20. So you really ended up with 40. The fifth time period, you were short by 10. Not to worry, because you had 40 from the previous time period. So you still have 30 left. And at the end of the sixth period, you will have zero inventory because you needed 280 in time period 6, but you had 250, 30 short, but you had 30 from the previous time period. So this particular production sequence of no changes met the objective here, but failed to meet the objective of no inventory and no stockouts, because you had inventory here, 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 stockouts here and here. The other possibility now is, okay, I will not change the production rate. I will not have inventory. I will have no stockouts. So what can I do? So you can actually hire and fire employees. So for example, I can have 26 employees in the first time period. If I have 26 employees instead of 25, I can produce 260. Second time period, I have only 21 employees. That will make it 210. So I am not having any changes in production. I won't have any idle time. However, I am hiring and firing, which is I'm changing the workforce. But here it is saying no changes in workforce. So this simple example shows that it is almost impossible to meet all of these objectives. So what you need to do in aggregate planning is identify the best possible combination. In this simple example, I want to find out for this particular demand, what is the ideal production which will meet all of these objectives to some extent, or meet the most important objectives. In some cases, it may be no inventory. Some cases, it may be no stockouts. In some cases, no changes in production rate. So there is a particular weight for each of these objectives. You have to look into that. We will get to the technique of aggregate planning in a few minutes. But this example should drive home this particular slide where the objectives are conflicting in nature. Now let's look at these basic aggregate planning strategies. What are the advantages of each one, drawbacks of each one, and costs for each strategy? Let's take the very first one, the varying workforce levels. This particular strategy is the least popular for obvious reason. So you're hiring and laying off with this strategy. Would you like this strategy if you were an employee? Obviously not, right? Because if you are an employee in this particular type of company where they routinely hire and lay off people, you would voluntarily leave at the first opportunity. So that is the first drawback of this particular strategy. Now first, let's look at why and when this strategy would be used. The reason varying workforce levels would be used would be, first thing, when there is seasonal work, where the workforce is pretty much in line with that strategy. They understand ahead of time that it's a seasonal job, like in construction or in tourism. you know that people are hired and laid off. Same thing with some retail sector. Now, what is the biggest cost in varying workforce levels? The hiring cost, training cost. You have to keep that in mind. When you hire somebody, you got to train them. There is a lot of money involved. Then you also have something that we call as the learning curve costs. Nobody will be as productive as they could be on day one or day two or month one. It'll take some time, depending upon the type of the work, for the employees to be on par with somebody who has been there for some time. So hiring people will have these extra costs. But if the skill level is very low, or if you have a huge pool of highly skilled and trained workers who can be picked from the labor market and placed into a project, like in a lot of software projects, then yes, you may be able to have the strategy of hiring and layoff. But in general, hiring and layoff is the last strategy that you want to use. If nothing else works for you, this may be something that you can use. The next one is varying work time. More understandable, more amenable to the workforce. Simply have overtime. Whenever the demand goes up, you schedule overtime. You schedule an extra shift. Now, overtime does not come cheap either. Overtime costs you time and a half in most cases. But will the employee be more productive during overtime to compensate for the time and a half expenses? Just the opposite. There have been a lot of studies which have shown that overtime can result in lack of productivity. People cannot work easily for more than 7-8 hours a day. Overtime can result in fatigue. It can result in quality issues. It can result in safety issues. There have been studies which show that initially employees were excited with overtime because of the opportunity to make extra money. But in the long run, overtime can be detrimental if it is not used sparsely and judiciously. But definitely it has an advantage over varying workforce levels because you don't have the hiring and training, learning curve issues. In addition, with overtime, you won't have the extra benefits like you would have with hiring an extra person. So there are definite advantages to overtime if it is used judiciously. Part-time is when you have somebody working during the peak times. Part-time can occur in restaurants, in movie theaters, a lot of other places, or even in manufacturing, where you hire somebody to just come in during some peak hours of demand or peak times of demand. Now, what is this undertime? Undertime is not used very often. It is basically when an employee gets paid full time but doesn't necessarily have to work full time occasionally. So, for example, you can have a software developer on the bench for a month or 15 days on full pay. So this person is one of the best in Oracle financial software and had a project in BNY Mellon which got over on May 30th. The next project is in PNC Bank and it starts only on July 15th. So you have 45 days. What do? You can send your employee to a training program for 3 weeks, and other 3 weeks you can just pay this employee and keep them on the workforce. You don't want to lose this highly trained and productive employee just because you don't have a project for him or her for 3 weeks. You pay them full salary. That is called undertime, where it is unaffordable option to lay off somebody and not a strategic and incur the hiring and training costs. Same thing, if you're manufacturing a Boeing type product where it is impossible to have inventory, you make to order, you make exactly what is required. So if you have enough workforce to produce 1000 Boeing 737s in a year, and your orders turn out to be 980 for the whole year, you may want to have 35 hours instead of 40 hours in 2 months out of the 12 months, so that you still are utilizing the same workforce, but there is some undertime and there is no inventory. So in a nutshell, undertime is used whenever inventory is prohibitive, very expensive to carry, you have to make to order, and secondly, when it is not judicious to hire and lay off very high skilled employees just because you don't have a project or work for them for a limited amount of time. Planned inventory. This is the safest when it comes to the employees. A good strategy. Keep inventory just in case the demand goes up or just in case the production is not what it was planned. It became you produced less or your supplier shipped less than what you wanted. So you have this inventory. However, you have to make sure that you understand that inventory also has costs involved. Now, what are the costs involved in inventory? We will have a whole chapter on inventory control. Half of this course addresses inventory control. But let's quickly look at some of the costs pertaining to inventory right away. Inventory, the first and the most important cost of inventory is the financial cost, which can be very high. If you're carrying inventory, you are either borrowing money or putting your own money in inventory. Is the value of inventory going up? No, but you're still paying your interest on the money that was borrowed, or you're losing the opportunity cost of putting the same money in some other form of investment. So that is the number one cost of inventory, the financial cost. Secondly, you need space to carry your inventory. You need to lease that space or buy that space, which costs you money. You need to keep that place heated, cool for some products, air conditioned, refrigerated. So all the utilities for the inventory area. You need personnel. You need people who will store the inventory, retrieve the inventory, maintain the inventory. Then there is the cost of obsolescence and depreciation. The longer you keep your inventory, you can be assured of losing money because of depreciation, or worst case scenario, zero value, which is obsolescence. The product can get obsolete. There have been studies which show that higher the inventory, higher the pilferage. People steal things. So there are several drawbacks and costs pertaining to inventory. Now I'm talking, when I say cost pertaining to inventory, you may wonder, so what? You need to carry inventory anyway. I am talking about excess inventory. If you can live with $80,000 worth of inventory on average, if you are carrying in reality $100,000 worth of inventory, I am talking about that extra 20,000, not the entire 100,000 worth of inventory. It will become more clear in the chapter pertaining to inventory. But for now, the summary of what I just said in the last 2 minutes is inventory has a lot of advantages because it doesn't affect the workforce. However, it comes at a cost, which can be as high as 40% of the cost of the product itself, and this 40% is spread around the year. The next strategy is back orders. Basically the opposite of inventory. If there is a demand and you don't have inventory, you back order. That is, you tell the customer that you will meet the demand later. It can be a product or it can be a service. You can call a dentist's office. Obviously, your order will be back ordered. You won't get an appointment right away unless you have an emergency. Your demand has been back ordered. Now, in some types of products, you can't afford to back order because that will result in a stock out. If you are looking for a consumer product in a grocery store or in a Kmart or a Walmart, if you don't find it and if you need it, you probably will go to the competitor's retail outlet and pick up that product. So if you want to use the strategy of back orders, you better have unique feature in your service or you have a unique product. Otherwise, the customer may not wait to buy the product or the service from you. If it's a professional service like a dentist or a specialist doctor, it is understandable. It is a good strategy, back ordering. If you are making a highly specialized kind of product, back orders are acceptable. Or if you have a very good pricing structure, back orders can be acceptable. If not, it can result in stockouts, which is detrimental for your company. Stockout is when you don't meet the demand at all. Back order is when you meet the demand late. So back orders and stockouts can result in loss of customers, loss of profit, and loss of customer goodwill if they are done routinely. Subcontracting. Here I am not referring to outsourcing, where you are routinely having a particular product or a component from a subcontractor, from an outside company. I'm talking about occasional subcontracting. Whenever you don't have the capacity or the inventory, you have another company making a similar product make the product for you. That kind of subcontracting is what I'm referring to here, because we are talking only about capacity, production, and inventory. We are not talking about strategic sourcing here. So when you do that kind of subcontracting, you have an advantage. You don't need to add the capacity. You don't need to have new workers. You don't need to have overtime. You don't need to have an extra shift. Still are able to meet the demand. That is the biggest advantage of subcontracting. However, what are the drawbacks and costs? If it is not properly planned, a last minute subcontracting can result in extra expenses. You may be paying a premium. Second, subcontractor may not be as reliable as you are. You are still liable to your customer for the quality and for the timeliness. But what if your subcontractor is not as reliable as you are? You are in trouble. Third, and the most important thing which happens sometimes, is the subcontractor becomes your competitor. If there are no compete clauses, which are difficult to have unless you are a big company subcontracting to a very small company, then the subcontractor can directly go to your customer. So there are some disadvantages to subcontracting. One is pricing. This is all the strategies that you can use to advertise, to promote, to discount the product or the service so that you can induce the customer into buying your product or service even though they were not originally inclined to buying your product or service. Whether you're an airline company selling tickets for half price, or a hotel or a retailer having 30% off, buy one get one free. All of these kind of pricing strategies which will help you improve the demand and better utilize your capacity or have the ability to get rid of the extra inventory that you have. That is the pricing strategy. The last one is complementary counter seasonal products. So as the name indicates, it is when you have seasonal products or services. The person who mows my lawn is the same person who blows snow during the winter than he has in the summer. In the summer he does landscaping and lawn mowing, and by October he gets rid of some of the employees but moves over to snow blowing. The same company which is making t-shirts, making sweaters too, making t-shirts during fall and winter to be sold during spring and summer, making winter jackets during spring and summer to be used in fall and winter. The same company making air conditioners also make furnaces. So the advantage for these companies is that although they are making a seasonal product, they can use their capacity, their workforce throughout the entire year. They don't have to worry about laying off and hiring workers. The only thing they have to worry about is the setup costs, moving from one production to another, and then some amount of extra training required to the employees. So these are the 7 aggregate planning strategies. If you want to split these or add the extra shift as another strategy, you will have more than 7. But essentially, these are the strategies that address aggregate planning in many companies. So what we have discussed are some of the advantages and drawbacks and costs pertaining to each strategy. These are some of the terminologies, academic terminologies. Some of the strategies are called capacity options, some are called demand options. So demand options are when you are influencing the demand aggressively. For example, the pricing strategy is a demand option. You're actively or aggressively influencing the demand. And it is capacity leading, meaning you already have the capacity here. You already have the hotel rooms. You already have bought the inventory of these products to sell. Whereas the passive or reactive strategy are also called as capacity options. Here you're trying to absorb the fluctuations in demand by hiring people over time. So here it is capacity lagging, meaning you are increasing capacity after the demand is known. So these are the 2 basic types of strategies. So what we discussed in the previous slide can be classified into passive or active, capacity lagging or capacity leading, capacity options and demand options. They can also be classified as chase and level. Chase strategies are again where you chase the demand. If demand goes up, you hire people. If demand goes up, you have overtime. That is a chase. A level strategy is when you have the same amount of production, whether demand goes up or goes down. If the demand goes up, you back order. If the demand goes down, you carry inventory. That is level strategy. Pure strategy and mixed strategies. This is very academic, but just to know what it is, pure strategy is when you are using only one out of these many options or strategies, whereas mixed strategy is when you have 2+ strategies used together, which is what in most cases companies do. They use multiple strategies. That is called mixed strategy. So this gives you an idea of the aggregate planning strategies, their costs and drawbacks, and their conflicting nature. Thank you.